Hello and welcome to the next in the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum's webinar series. Today is Managing Shipping Risk in Marine Protected Areas. And please note that this webinar is being recorded. I am Megan Matheson, the Director of Research and Knowledge Mobilization at Clear Seas Centre for Responsible Marine Shipping, an independent not-for-profit research centre that supports safe and sustainable marine shipping in Canada. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, because Clear Seas is headquartered in Vancouver, BC, but our mandate serves all peoples in Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis from coast to coast to coast. I recognize Indigenous peoples have a deep-rooted culture and a connection to the land and waters known as Canada. The Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum is a community of practice launched in 2019 by MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction and Response Network, and Clear Seas with support from Exact Earth. The community of practice is open to people and organizations working in or conducting research on shipping risk. It provides those interested with a platform to network and share knowledge around shipping risk. The community of practice is one of several supported by MEOPAR, which is an independent not-for-profit that funds research, trains students, mobilizes knowledge, and forms partnerships in the area of marine risk and resilience. These communities of practice help mobilize knowledge, enrich research, and encourage collaboration between academics, practitioners, policymakers, and community groups. Before we move on to the agenda for today, I'd like to do a quick poll of the audience to find out what brings you here today. Please take a moment to complete the poll that will be on your screen shortly, and then we'll share the results. While we wait for the poll results, I want to draw your attention to the bottom or possibly the top of your screen where it says question and answer, or Q&A rather. We've got presentations that will take approximately 35 minutes today, and after that we'll have time for questions. So as questions occur to you, please enter those in the Q&A section of your screen. Jennifer Steele, Clear Seas Research Manager, will curate these questions and make sure our panelists are able to address them. If we don't get the time to get to your question, we'll make sure it gets answered via email. I think we'll close the poll and let's see what the results tell us. All right, we have a good proportion coming from government today, and then a smattering from the other categories. It's great to see everybody joining us today. So to look at our agenda for today, we've got some great speakers lined up for today's webinar. We're going to start with an overview of Transport Canada's role in the management and regulation of shipping activities in Canada, presented by Michelle Charon. We'll then hear from the trio that spearheaded the development of the MPA toolkit, Kim Dunn, Stephanie Hewson, and Mike Koval. Then these four will be joined by Colleen Turlow from Oceans North for a panel discussion and Q&A session on the topic of marine protected areas and shipping risk. The chat function is enabled, so you can contact my co-host Jennifer Steele or the technical host Cindy Marvin with MEOPAR if you're experiencing any issues. Please ask any questions for the Q&A session using the questions function on your console. I will now hand over to Michelle Charon, Manager and Senior Policy Advisor of the Clean Water Policy Division with Transport Canada. Before water, Michelle worked in the trees for the Canadian Forest Service as an Innovation Program Officer and Senior Economist for Natural Resources Canada. Michelle has a master's degree in physical geography and is based in Ottawa.
Thank you, Megan. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to give this technology a shot. And all right. So as Megan said, I'm with Transport Canada in Ottawa with a group called Clean Water Policy. Transport Canada has been involved in supporting work on marine protected areas for many years, but more recently, with the more concerted push to achieve conservation targets, there's been a need for kind of a more coordinated approach and some strategic thinking about Transport Canada's involvement and how we can best support the MPA departments, and that responsibility currently lies with Clean Water Policy. However, a lot of the technical expertise regarding regulation of vessels regarding pollution and discharge remains with the various expert groups in Ottawa and in the region. And I'm happy that many of my colleagues are with us today in attendance. All right, here we go. So, the Transport Canada, I think the first thing to sort of be aware of is that Transport Canada is not a marine protected area department per se. The marine protected area departments at the federal level are Fisheries and Oceans, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the Parks Canada Agency. Transport Canada really supports all of these departments and agencies in their work to protect and conserve marine environments. The main area, as you can imagine, where Transport Canada comes in and provides advice and support is on with respect to marine transportation activities and any measures that the MPA departments may choose to propose, or any threats to conservation objectives that the MPA departments identified that are linked to marine transportation. That's where Transport Canada comes in. So that's kind of laid out here in this next slide, where typically lead organizations through their own expertise and through their engagement processes, will identify some form of threat to a conservation objective from shipping, and sometimes the conservation objectives of a marine protected area are not affected by shipping activity, in which case there's no need necessarily to put in controls. But if shipping is determined to have an impact on conservation objectives, then those lead departments will engage more fully with Transport Canada. Transport Canada's main role is of course, to ensure safe, efficient transportation or movement of people and goods, and protection of the marine environment. And that's definitely a perspective that we bring to the table when we engage with marine protected area departments. I'll give a really good example that was relatively recent. So for those of you who may be familiar with the Banc des Américains Marine Protected Area under the Oceans Act, gray water discharge was identified as a threat to conservation objectives for that park, that marine protected area, apologies. And as a result, but other shipping activities were not, as I understand it, and therefore, while Oceans Act marine protected areas have a general prohibition, then there's exemptions for activities that aren't impactful, and shipping is exempted. However, then there is a prohibition on gray water discharge, and that was done under the Oceans Act regulation for the Banc des Américains, but in consultation with Transport Canada to ensure that that kind of prohibition was operationally feasible in that area. Transport Canada doesn't necessarily, or actually we don't currently regulate shipping activities in marine protected areas. Transport Canada has a comprehensive regime that regulates shipping in all Canadian waters. The main piece of legislation we're talking about is the Canada Shipping Act 2001 and several regulations under it. And specific to discharges, the vessel pollution and dangerous chemical regs. Although there are others, and of course there are also more specific rules and regulations in the Arctic that I'll touch on briefly a little further along in the presentation. So the VPDCR, as we refer to them, cover a lot of forms of discharge, and one of the main things that they do as well is they implement international requirements within Canada. And I guess the other, so I mentioned one thing to keep in mind is that Transport Canada isn't a marine protected area department. The other thing is that shipping is global, right? It's meant to move goods around the world. And therefore, a certain level of standardization in how shipping is managed and regulated from one jurisdiction to another is absolutely necessary to ensure that that global transportation system on which we all rely is coherent and operates smoothly. Other rules in place regarding types of discharge are ballast water regulations, which, as some of you may have seen, have just been amended and were published yesterday. The new ballast water, or the updated ballast water regulations, are going to require ships to manage to treat ballast water. And as you can see here on the slide, this is an update that's expected to have very tangible, concrete impact um, on invasive species. And again, an example of management of shipping activities and of potential risks from shipping that apply in all Canadian waters, including marine protected areas, but certainly not just marine protected areas. I mentioned the Arctic. Another important part of our kind of regulatory framework is the more stringent requirements in the Arctic, and that's done under the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act and its regulations. And this really, as I think everyone gathered here today can understand, is in response to the need for more stringent controls in the Arctic and to align with international obligations that are specific for the Arctic. How do we ensure compliance, and what sort of enforcement work do we do? And this is very high level. There's an annual inspection plan, so vessels are inspected, and there can also be risk-based and targeted random monitoring of vessels. We have a suite of options. The Department or Transport Canada has a suite of options if a vessel is found to be non-compliant. That can range from just from, I shouldn't say just, but from issuing directives, so you must fix this, all the way up to prosecution, significant financial penalties, and detention. I've been focusing on mandatory measures and sort of regulations, but I think it's important to take a second to also touch on how effective voluntary measures can be for the protection of the environment. Transport Canada, especially more recently in working with other government departments on protection of endangered whales, has been using a mixture of mandatory and voluntary measures. And in some cases, the voluntary measures can be as effective, if not more effective, than mandatory measures. And I think good examples of this are when partners are fully engaged and empowered, and we have voluntary measures like the one led by the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's ECHO program, which we support in the Salish Sea, and their slowdown measures that have participation rates of well over 80, 85, and even over 90%, I believe, most recently. So I think that when we're looking at managing vessel traffic in marine protected areas, managing vessel or shipping activities in marine protected areas, we need to look beyond just regulations and what can be done through regulation. Last thing I would like to touch on before last thing is just the federal marine protection standards, which were announced in April 29, because they include they include prohibited activities, and one of those is dumping. Transport Canada is working really closely with the Marine Protected Area departments and other departments on really scoping out what that dumping prohibition means. And And that is part of, I would say, Transport Canada's kind of increased engagement on the marine protected areas overall. And that increased engagement is just really necessary as we're driving towards 25% and 30% of marine protected areas by 2025 and 2030, because I mean ultimately those are really big amounts of navigable water. Not that all 25% would necessarily be navigable water, but a large part of it will be, and that's bound to have impact on the safe and efficient movement of people and goods. So we are continuously reviewing and updating legal and policy tools. And I mean, yesterday's publication of the ballast water regs is an example of how we continue to learn and to improve. And I think one of the areas as well, I really like this last bullet of growing scientific understanding of, cumulative impacts of marine transportation. And I think one of the big changes that we're seeing is, continued focus on spills and accidents that can have great impacts, but also increased focus on and increased science and understanding on the impacts of shipping activity when everything is operating properly and going well. And I think that that's an important area to continue to work in. And I know that we will be continuing to work on that area. That is it for my presentation. I've kept it very high level in the hopes of leaving time for lots of questions. So I guess I'll turn it over to Megan to let us know where we go now, if we're doing questions right away or saving that for the panel.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we'll save questions for the panel. So if you do have questions that you want to specifically direct to Michelle, please put them in the Q&A and you can put his name in front of them or something to indicate that you'd like them to be directed to him. And we will now hand over to Kim Dunn, Stephanie Hewson, and Mike Koffel to present the MPA Toolkit. So I'll just do brief introductions first before handing over the screen. Kim is the manager of the National Oceans Governance at WWF Canada. She's a specialist in marine conservation with a collaborative approach for the intersection of community, industry, and nature. She's also a formal naval officer and has a master's degree in resource and environmental management. Kim is based in Victoria, BC. Stephanie is a staff lawyer with the West Coast Environmental Law and part of their marine program working to strengthen ocean protection provincially and nationally. Stephanie graduated from McGill's law program and is based in Vancouver, BC. Mike is a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law and also volunteers with the Community Justice Society in Halifax. Mike graduated from Dalhousie 3 times, most recently from the School of Law, specializing in marine law and environmental law. Mike is based in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And now they will be speaking to you about reducing impacts from shipping in marine protected areas.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful presentation. It's so great to hear how Transport Canada is engaging more fulsomely with the MPA processes here in Canada. And hello, everyone. We're so pleased to be part of this panel and this webinar today. And as Megan has said, my name is Kim Dunn, and I'm with WWF Canada. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Stephanie Hewson from West Coast Environmental Law and Mike Koffel from East Coast Environmental Law. And we'd like to acknowledge that we're joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Mi'kmaq peoples. And today we're going to be introducing you to a new set of resources for reducing the impacts of shipping from MPAs in Canada, something we call very flashily the Shipping and MPAs Toolkit. And this has been a joint project over the last 3 years between WWF and East Coast and West Coast Environment. And so I'll begin by saying that over the past decades, what we found as MPA and as marine conservation practitioners is that shipping generally does not receive the same amount of attention and consideration during the MPA design and management process compared to other human activities. And the comparison that I like to make is with fishing. And so when we're in the middle of, MPA design, and when we're talking about management measures for MPAs, and we're talking about fishing, we talk about species, we talk about seasonality, we talk about gear types. The conversation that we have about fishing is very rich. It's very deep, it's very broad, it's very, very granular. And we're not having that same conversation about shipping. And really, I think that we should be. And so we set out to help address what we saw as this challenge by assembling a toolkit. And really, the toolkit aims to improve our collective understanding of the domestic and international tools that we have at our disposal to reduce impacts from shipping and MPAs in Canada. And Michel in his presentation touched on some of these tools already, and we'll talk about some more of them here today, but all of them are included in the toolkit. I'll tell you that the audience for the toolkit really, of course, is anyone who is interested, but most specifically, the toolkit was designed for MPA practitioners and shipping experts, or folks who are involved in MPA processes, so the design and management of MPAs. And the geographic scope of the toolkit is for all Canadian marine waters, so from the coastline to the EEZ, inclusive of the Arctic. And so what is in this toolkit? So I'm very happy to say that we are pleased to offer a 15-page quick reference guide, which gives you an overall summary and will sort of orient you to the rest of the contents of the toolkit. We also have 4 literature reviews that focus on the impacts from shipping on 4 specific habitat types or species. So we have one for birds, one for benthic habitats, one for ice habitats, and one that focuses specifically on cetaceans. We also have a report that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, and that's an analysis of the legal tools that are available for reducing impacts from shipping and MPAs. And that's a report called Navigating the Law that Mike and Stephanie will speak to later. There's also an evaluation that was done last year on the tools for monitoring and compliance, which can be found in the toolkit. And we've also compiled 3 case studies. So the last of these case studies for Telurtupamunga has yet to be released. It's coming soon. This month is my hope. But we'll certainly today be touching on some of the highlights and the lessons learned from the St. Anne's Bank MPA case study, as well as the Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area. And you can see the case study in its entirety. I've got the web URL down at the bottom here. We'll also pop that into the chat for you at some point, and you can navigate to the full toolkit via the WWF Canada website on the oceans page as well. I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Stephanie now. They're going to walk us through some of the highlights from the toolkit and briefly introduce us to 2 of the case studies.
Thanks, Kim. So as Kim mentioned, one of the reasons for the toolkit was that we found information on MPAs and shipping was hard to access. So I wanted to highlight 2 of the features of the toolkit here that will help make this information more accessible. So the first is this chart. This one here excerpted is about Oceans Act MPAs, and it goes through the regulations for each MPA, identifies the maritime zone that the MPA is in, as well as any of the provisions that relate to shipping activities within the area. And we've done this for each of the types of federal MPAs. And then in the back, you see a chart that we have. We have a number of maps prepared that help visualize the locations of different MPAs and other marine protection measures. So this shows you the whole coastline, but there's also specific maps for each coast, Arctic, Atlantic, and Pacific. So I think I'll pass it to Mike to talk about a few other aspects of the toolkit.
Hi, everyone, and Kim, you can go to the next slide there. Yeah, so really the Navigating the Law report, which is the legal analysis, has kind of 2 primary components, which is the MPA laws, the laws that create MPAs in Canada in the context of shipping. So that means the 3 that we've chosen are the Oceans Act and Oceans Act MPAs, National Marine Conservation Areas, and marine components of the national wildlife areas. And we really talk about and examine how those tools can be used to manage shipping impacts. And then the second component of the legal analysis, the primary component, is shipping laws in the context of MPAs. So Michelle already went over some of the really important tools. So we spend a lot of time focusing on the Canada Shipping Act. There's also other laws that relate to managing and regulating shipping. And we focus really on those components of those laws that deal with environmental protection and how they might be used to protect MPAs from shipping impacts, either by reducing those impacts or eliminating them altogether. Kim, you can go to the next slide there. And so there's this really great feature at the end of the toolkit, the Appendix A, the protection options reference table, what we like to call it PORT. So you can go to PORT, and it's really exactly what it sounds like. It's a reference table that provides some really brief information about the various tools that can be used to protect against and mitigate against shipping impacts or ship stressors in MPAs in Canada. And so I've provided some general stressors. So these are just, so if you're looking to just generally protect against shipping impacts, general mitigation, then there's various things that can be done, and there's various tools. So for instance, under the Oceans Act, there's a general tool that allows you to use notice to mariners and to provide the shipping industry, mariners, with more information about MPAs. So letting a ship captain know that they're about to enter or pass near an MPA and giving them more information about that MPA. Under the Canada Shipping Act, there are interim ministerial orders that can be used in all 4 of the zones. So internal waters, territorial sea, the contiguous zone, or the EZ. And this power allows the minister to take an interim, to create an interim measure using some of the authority under the Canada Shipping Act that they could use to make regulation. And then they can extend the time on that interim order or actually turn it into a full regulation. And then there's all kinds of other tools. One of the other example I have here are creating regulations. So there's a very broad power under the Canada Shipping Act to create regulations for the protection of the marine environment generally. And there's various things under that regulation power that could be used to protect MPAs from shipping stressors. Kim, you can go to the next slide there. And then there's all kinds of specific tools we've highlighted in the report and that are kind of just highlighted here in the report as well. So for instance, Greywater, Michelle already mentioned Greywater and the American Bank, but there's also tools under the Canada Shipping Act that can be used to either restrict or fully prohibit greywater discharge in MPAs. If you want to focus on something specific like the benthic habitat, so the bottom of the sea floor, and you want to focus on anchorage, you're worried about impacts either on the entire MPA or portion of the MPA, then there's tools and the anchorage regulations under the Canada Shipping Act to do exactly that, so to restrict or prohibit anchorage. And then just one other example with a little bit of international flavor is the acoustic disturbances or noise. So taking the IMO guidelines for reducing underwater noise and adopting them by reference into regulation, whether it's an MPA regulation, so under one of the 3 laws that I had mentioned there, or in its own regulation, and making sure that rather than trying to reinvent the wheel to address noise impacts, we just take those IMO guidelines and adopt them by reference into law or regulation. Kim, you can probably go to the next slide. So that's just some of the examples of the various things in the toolkit. And now I'm going to talk quickly about the St. Anne's Bank Marine Protected Area, which is one of the 3 case studies. And I was really involved with this case study because I live on the East Coast. Really the purpose of the case studies was to kind of get an understanding of how are shipping impacts being assessed when creating MPAs? How are shipping impacts currently being addressed and protected and managed against? And then what can we learn from this MPA and apply to similar MPAs in the future, or perhaps even in the St. Anne's Bank in the future as we're looking to improve our management there. So the St. Anne's Bank is Oceans Act MPA. It's located on the eastern coast of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. And shipping is not regulated in that MPA. So early on in the designation and identification stage for the St. Anne's Bank Marine Protected Area, AOI, so the area of interest, there was discussions about the various different impacts in St. Anne's Bank, and shipping was identified as a potential concern, having potential impacts in the MPA. Unfortunately, early on in those kind of discussions and the assessment, there were these perceived limitations on the ability of government to actually regulate shipping in MPAs in St. Anne's Bank. And at a very early stage, there was essentially a conclusion that shipping couldn't be regulated, and so it never really went further. And the St. Anne's Bank regulations were created with the general kind of prohibition that you see in a lot of MPAs against destroying or causing adverse effects in the MPA. And then there's this very broad exception that navigation may be carried out in the MPA, essentially allowing ships free range in the MPA. And I think this is important because I think if a discussion had been had about shipping impacts that would have went further than that kind of initial stage, I think there could have been some really great work on figuring out ways to reduce shipping impacts. So you see on the right-hand corner there an overlap between St. Anne's Bank MPA and a large ballast water exchange zone. So that actually allows ships to come in from other parts of the world to stop within a portion of the St. Anne's Bank and exchange their ballast water, thereby causing potential implications for the St. Anne's Bank marine protected area from things like invasive species. So that's just one of the examples. And I think kind of the conclusion that came out of at least this case study was that I think there could have been a stronger push to manage shipping impacts in the MPA. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in the future as we consider how these MPAs are created and managed. I think I'll turn it out to Stephanie now.
Thanks, Mike. So I'll just touch on the Pacific Coast case study, which was on the Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area, which is a Canada Wildlife Act, MNWA, the only one in Canada. And it's an interesting case study as well because it spans 3 maritime zones. And there is shipping traffic that travels through the area. And it has the blanket prohibition that Michelle talked about with a similar exception for vessels navigating in accordance with the Canada Shipping Act. What's interesting about this area is there are a few very specific regulatory mechanisms in place to address largely impacts from shipping relating to predator invasion and aquatic invasive species. So these are around approach distances, anchorages, and restricting the introduction of living organisms within the Marine National Wildlife Area. But otherwise, shipping traffic is still largely the same as before. And there aren't other measures in place through the regulations to address these impacts. So in the case study, we look more deeply into those impacts, into the species at risk that use this area, and some of the impacts include oil spills, vessel disturbances, and ship strikes. So within that case study, there's a breakdown and analysis of the different impacts and regulatory tools that could be used to address them. And I'll just go to the next slide to show you an important part of the analysis, which we don't have time to go through today, but we wanted to point out that in the appendices of each case study, there's also a breakdown of vessel traffic data, such as predicted discharge, traffic intensity, speed, fuel use, and interactions with important habitats by vessel type. And this level of analysis is not usually conducted for MPAs, and it's something that we highly recommend be incorporated into planning processes going forward. So these here, what we have on this slide, are the first few visualizations of vessel traffic intensity by ship type for St. Anne's Bank and Scott Islands. And I'll just conclude this discussion of the case studies by summarizing a few of the recommendations that came out of it. So as we've mentioned before, historically, many of the impacts of shipping in MPAs have not been addressed. And the process of addressing shipping impacts really needs to start early. I think those maps and some of the analysis Mike talked about demonstrate what type of analysis, the level that can be done, and the ways that that analysis can help identify specific regulatory or management mechanisms to address the specific impacts and also the specific habitats and wildlife and sensitive ecosystems within each MPA. And I'll also mention, I think, that an important point, which is the toolkit focuses on regulation, and we think that's a very important element of any for any MPA. And there is also a rule for other types of measures that can be used as scaffolding while those types of mandatory measures are being implemented. And I think the last point that is probably obvious but worth mentioning that came out of the case studies are that the management of the shipping in MPAs also needs to be part of a broader vessel management program, just by the very nature of what shipping is. So each case study has quite detailed recommendations that came out of the specific areas, and getting into the specifics was quite helpful. So just encourage you to look at them if you're interested. And I think I'll just close now, shift to the broader toolkit and some of the lessons learned. I think that going back to the main purpose, our big focus is on knowledge development and sharing around the impacts of shipping, information about MPAs, and information about the legal tools that already do exist and can be used to better protect MPAs. So we want practitioners to be aware of these tools, and then ultimately the goals are to reduce the pressures on marine life within MPAs and other sensitive ecosystems, and also creating more certainty for and clarity for operators within those areas.
Thanks, Mike and Stephanie. And this is the conclusion of our presentation. I've left our contact information here. If anyone ever wants to reach out to us to talk more about the toolkit, we're always very pleased to have a conversation about it. Or even if you have quick questions, feel free to reach out anytime. And I've dropped the link here again for the entire toolkit. And again, we'll try to put that in the chat or in the Q&A for you. And that's it. I think, Megan, I'll turn it over to you again, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Kim and Stephanie and Mike. That was a great presentation. I just wanted to take a moment to remind everybody, if you've got questions, and we're already seeing quite a few, please make sure to put them in the Q&A button. There's two little speech bubbles there, I guess one for Q, one for A. And then we'll make sure we can answer those when we get to the panel discussion in just a moment. But before we move into panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Colleen Turlow, who is a policy advisor at Oceans North. Colleen's work currently focuses on community engagement in marine conservation initiatives, including marine protected areas and shipping. She's worked in both Arctic and Atlantic regions, and she also has extensive knowledge about sustainable seafood market initiatives. She earned a master's degree in marine management from Dalhousie University and is based in Halifax, in Nova Scotia. So I'd now like to invite all our panelists to join us, and we will start off with looking at the questions we have in the Q&A. And I'd just like to ask a general question of the panel to start with, and anybody who feels that they have something to comment on is welcome to jump in. So how is it determined that shipping has an impact on conservation objectives? Who's involved in identifying potential impacts to those objectives, and what is the process?
I can take a first cut at that, and really to say that the only one I can speak to with some certainty is the Oceans Act MPA, and that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a risk of a very well-developed risk assessment process to identify risks and conservation objectives. But I have to, I don't know the content of that. I just know that they have a process that they stick to on that.
I can probably elaborate a little bit, Michelle. And so Michelle is right that DFO has, in the last couple of years, unrolled a risk analysis process that does include shipping and shipping stressors as part of the risk matrix. And so, but I will also add that each of the departments who creates MPAs uses a slightly different process. They use a process that's different, that works for them and that is designed for their own regulatory process for the establishment and design of MPAs. And so that risk analysis looks different in every case. And I would also offer, for what it's worth, and if there is anyone online who has more to say about it, I would encourage them to pipe up as well. But there's variability between region as well. And so even I would say in working over the past many years with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, for example, on Oceans Act MPAs, colleagues of mine, we tend to note that there's variability between region in terms of how the risk analysis process is done. I think there's more standardization that has begun to happen. But in terms of the incorporation of shipping, I think part of the impetus for the toolkit, frankly, is that we saw so much variability in the dialogue and the consideration that shipping was having between each protected area in Canada, and again, between regions. Colleen, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add to that.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I guess just kind of a comment on that. I think that's a great question and something that is definitely really important. And when we're talking about the marine environment, and especially when we're talking about the marine soundscapes, when you talk about what is the impact of shipping on conservation objectives, it is one of those things that's pretty hard to prove. I mean, unless we're talking about ship strikes or gear entanglement or some of those visible impacts. Things like noise. I know my team's been working outside of Pond Inlet in Eclipse Sound for over 7 years now, doing acoustic studies on narwhal interactions and behavior with vessel traffic. And after 7 years, it's still extremely hard to pinpoint and explain directly what types of shipping, what speeds of vessels, the weight, the direction, the seasonality, if there's ice present or not. It's really hard to prove those things. So for me, I think one of the things that when I was thinking about this panel was, for MPAs and these really special sensitive areas that have been identified, maybe it's worth turning this sort of thought on its head and saying, instead of proving that something does cause the environment or the local communities harm, why don't we regulate or minimize potential impacts until we can prove that it doesn't harm the environment and the communities in those spaces. It's 2021. There's lots of technology available, and there's a lot of uncertainties. And so I think using the precautionary approach and after conservation objectives are identified, I think it just seems like one of those areas, even if things are restricted within MPAs, you think about buffer zones and how sound travels and how discharge travels. That St. Anne's Bank example was perfect. So I just, I would say that maybe this is a time to start thinking in that precautionary manner.
Thanks, everyone. I just want to make a note to the audience that if there's a question that you've seen asked in the Q&A that you really want to hear the answer to, you can click on the little thumbs up button in the bottom left corner of the question to upvote it to the top of the list. But we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And if there are questions we don't get to with the panelists today, we will try to answer those by email and send them the responses out afterwards. So at the top of our list currently is a question from Paul Blomaris, who's the Executive Director of Clear Seas. And does the panel have a view on the utility and effectiveness of IMO, particularly sensitive sea areas and areas to be avoided as a way of managing shipping in sensitive areas?
I'm happy to start on that, and then please jump in, anyone else. So I think those tools are extremely effective, and they are designed to address shipping, which is an international activity at an international level. So that is probably their biggest strength. One of the challenges is the amount of time it takes to gain approval for the different designations. But then once they're in place, they are quite powerful. And both a PSSA, doesn't have legal requirements on its own, but they're called associated protective measures, like an area to be avoided would be attached to it. But PSSA designation on its own also signifies, the intrinsic value of an area and raises the profile of that area. So I do think they're quite effective.
Thank you, Stephanie.
No one else
Anybody
has anything
else?
to say? Yeah, I might just say that I think, first of all, I want to thank everyone for the toolkit because it is an incredible resource, and I am not envious of how much time I'm sure it took to do all that. But I do think one thing that the toolkit highlights is the complexities of even just the Canadian tools and frameworks and acts and regulations that impact marine spaces. And then you can expand into the international sphere, which also has its own tools, which are all very useful. And I think that what maybe the toolkit highlighted most for me was sort of the need to have a bit more of a comprehensive approach. There are tools available. There's a full suite of things. Shipping is global, and while each area might have certain particular sensitivities or activities that do or do not occur, or species or communities that are dependent on certain things in the area, I think it's time to start looking at this sort of full suite of tools and what exists. And I really appreciated the team for going through for suggesting kind of going through those heat maps of shipping intensity and different types of activities happening there, so that you could be able to choose and incorporate existing tools, but within that MPA framework, so you don't have to look elsewhere to kind of piecemeal and put together. I think a lot of, at least the communities that I work with, when you say we're going to have or let's talk about a marine protected area and what does it include, they assume that it can do more than it actually can at this point. And so I think it's time for this inclusivity, and whether it is an area to be avoided or a particularly sensitive sea area or an OECM or an NMCA, I think that they all have values that can be used, and the establishment of the marine protected area can kind of use all these tools that are available and incorporate them. And one of the things that we're working on at Oceans North is integrated Arctic corridors, which is a Transport Canada initiative. That's just another example of a way to kind of more comprehensively manage shipping. It's currently a voluntary measure, but to ensure that we do it right and we incorporate safety and security and Inuit rights and governance and environmental concerns, and kind of have this more holistic approach. And like we see with different, depending on which department is establishing a certain protected area, they'll have different objectives or goals and tools. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's time to kind of bring them together and use them on the spaces that make the most sense.
And just quickly commenting, because I don't want to take a lot of time, but in terms of the PSSAs, one of the requirements at the international level is to actually show that there's a reason to protect that area, so that there's actually adverse effects or other risks. So I think that the current MPAs, and I saw a question there about MPA networks as well, but the Canadian effort to create MPAs, there's a lot of science that goes into that, a lot of risk assessment, and using that as the foundation to make your case gets you one step ahead of that kind of long process. So rather than starting from scratch in a new area, using a single MPA or even having a region of MPAs, an MPA network would be that first step to ensuring that you can get that PSSA in a timely manner. So.
Thanks, everyone. Our next question is from Robert Louis Manning, the president of the BC Chamber of Shipping, and it's directed at Kim. Kim, I agree that shipping appears to be an afterthought in many or most or all of MPA, NWA, NMCA processes. Are there any elements of federal governance that constrain being more proactive?
I don't
think so, Robert. The question is, are there any elements of federal governance that constrain being more proactive? Yeah, I don't think so. I think that we have really fairly robust MPA design processes in Canada now, and certainly over the last years with the push to some of our more ambitious marine conservation targets in Canada, we've really even stepped up those processes even more, and we see more interdepartmental coordination. We see more rights holders at tables. We see more stakeholders at tables. And I think it just comes down to folks like you, Robert, and folks like me and all of us. If for some reason the shipping conversation isn't happening by itself, we need to ask for it to happen, and we need to prioritize it or ask for it to be prioritized in a way that other industries have had their impacts and their stressors prioritized. So I don't see any constraints at the federal level. I think the toolkit has shown us that we have a lot of tools at our disposal. We also have an enormous amount of data. We have an enormous amount of vessel traffic data. We have an enormous amount of ecological data. We've shown, I think, through the toolkit and through some of the more recent MPA processes that the analysis that's necessary to design MPAs that take into consideration shipping at a more granular level are very, very possible. They're very within our reach. We just have to do them. And yes, I think it is a loaded question, but thank you for it anyways, Robert.
Our next question is from Stephen Peck, and it's for Michelle. Has the shipping industry raised concerns related to the impact of MPAs on shipping through the Canadian Marine Advisory Committee, CMAC?
Oh, good question. The industry has raised concerns about marine protected areas and impact on their operations. I do not know if they have been raised formally through CMAC, but certainly they have been raised through formal correspondence to the minister, as well as through informal interactions with departmental officials, including myself.
Thank you. Our next question, we'll take one from Gerald Graham. And this is, I think, directed generally at the panel. Do you think that a massive increase in the numbers of tankers transiting Boundary Pass is an activity that is consistent with the proposed Southern State of Georgia National Marine Conservation Area Reserve?
I can take a stab at it because this is more or less my backyard. It's Stephanie's too. I don't have a conclusive answer for you, but I think that it's definitely something to be thinking about. I think, thinking about, when we're doing any of this type of analysis for shipping and MPAs, thinking about projections, we know that shipping traffic is going to increase globally quite a lot over the next, 30 years at least, if not longer than that. And there are some regions in Canada, including here on the West Coast, where we expect to have pretty significant increases in certain types of traffic. And I think that is absolutely the thing that we need to be considering very, very carefully when we're looking at our MPAs and those special places that we've decided need better levels of protection and management. So I don't have an answer for you one way or another, other than to say that it's absolutely something that should be looked at very, very closely.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with that area in particular, but it sounds like a similar thing that's happening up in Nunavut, Tellerutiopa-Manga, and MCA, with projections of a significant doubling, tripling, or potentially quadrupling of iron ore mine vessel activity in an already established NMCA. So thinking about cumulative impacts, thinking about future impacts, those are all things that are very important to make sure are addressed, and that the communities are involved in making those decisions.
There's a question that wasn't able to be asked in the Q&A, and this is from Jean Sargent, are there regulatory measures that can be used to reduce the impacts of shipping outside of MPAs? For example, reducing greywater discharge just outside of an MPA, which could spill into a protected area. And that's generally for the panel.
That's a great question, and I think a really important consideration that is helpfully being raised more and more. And I'll just say so far MPAs haven't really been designed with buffer zones in mind, but there's no reason why they can't be and shouldn't be. We already have pretty impressive examples of zoning within MPAs, so including a buffer zone outside of an MPA shouldn't be a problem. And I'm actually, maybe Mike is going to know the answer to this, but I'm pretty sure there is an East Coast MPA with a buffer zone of some kind already built in, or at least in the management measures. So it's a great point, and I think something that needs to be taken seriously going forward. Like as Colleen mentioned, noise travels and discharge travels, and that's just the nature of water. So have to take that into consideration in design.
Yes, definitely. I'm not recalling off the top of my head any MPA that has a buffer zone, but I agree. I think that MPAs could have a buffer zone built into them. There could also be buffer zones between certain things like ballast water exchange zones and MPAs as well. So thinking about the tools that are already there and just thinking about how to use them so that we're not causing overlaps or things to kind of come right up against each other.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for questions today. We've got so many more great questions, but we'll try to tackle those by email so that we can get responses back to the people asking. I'd like to thank everybody who participated and took the time to join us today. We really appreciate your input and questions. The presentations and the recording of the webinar will be made available by email in the coming days to all those who've registered. The email will also include a link to join the CMSRF mailing list if you want to sign up. We'll send out periodic notifications of upcoming events and other items of interest like more webinars. And before we end this webinar, we have one final question for you. We have a poll as to what should our next webinar topic be, and we'd just like your quick input on that. So if we'll see the poll shortly, but one option is, could the Ever Given Suez Canal grounding incident happen in Canada's St. Lawrence Seaway? Another option is understanding shipping risk in the Arctic, ice impacts, oil spill response, community perspectives, addressing risks and perceptions, effectively communicating shipping risk to diverse audiences. And you can choose more than one if you like more than one of these topics. Incorporating Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into shipping risk assessments, the role of technology in reducing risk for shipping industry, comparing AIS types, ground-based and satellite, and understanding and managing risks to ships, such as weather and climate change, supply chain disruptions, pandemics, etc. Give just another moment for people to vote. And then let's close that, and we'll see what makes the top of the list. The Arctic is looking very popular, and incorporating Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into shipping risk assessments gets the highest ranking. So that's great to know. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. We'll wrap up now.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.